And on the other hand, we have our ham radio life. And there might be some overlap of those, and there might not be some overlap of those. But it isn't often that we are well known and do great things in both pieces of our lives. Our speaker today, Joe Taylor, does. In his personal and professional life, he is a Nobel laureate. That means you've won the Nobel Prize. There's only, in the area of physics, since they've been giving out this award in 1901, there's only 196 people in the last 113 years who have won a Nobel Prize in physics. And we're among one today. Joe got his bachelor's degree in physics, his PhD in astronomy from Hartford in 1968, taught various places. The most recent one was 26 years at Princeton. He received many honors associated with physics, including the Albert Einstein Medal, you may have heard of that guy, the Wolf Prize in Physics in 1992, and in 1993, the Nobel Prize in Physics. And he received the Nobel for the discovery of a new type of pulsar, a discovery that has opened up new possibilities for the study of gravitation. Now that's the layman stuff that they give you and me. The real technical stuff, I don't even understand it, and I got a PhD too. So in the field of physics, Joe is one of the giants in the world of physics. He's also one of the giants, in my view, in the world of amateur radio. He was first licensed in 1954 as a KN2 ITP, very, very active on the VHF bands and up. Developer of the WSJT software that's opened up UHF and VHF and moon bounce and weak signal work to thousands and thousands of hams across the nation and across the world. He originally, when he became a ham, that actually is what got him interested in radio astronomy and set his personal, professional career going. But Joe has been one of the giants in VHF, UHF, weak signal work, JT65, and all of those kinds of things, EME. So please join me in welcoming one of the giants of the world of physics and one of the giants of the world of ham radio, K1JT, Joe Taylor.
Thanks very much, Rick, and thanks to all of you for being here at this really wonderful occasion. It's a special pleasure, really, to be with you today and to take part in this celebration of 100 years of organized amateur radio in North America. What a glorious century it's been. Glorious in a general sense for amateur radio as a national service and as a fascinating and educational hobby, and more particularly, glorious for the organization that's hosting us for this centennial celebration. For 10 full decades now, the American Radio Relay League has represented the interests of private citizen radio enthusiasts in the United States and Canada, and it's facilitated ways in which together we members help to fulfill the mission of the amateur radio service. Our league has worked with government agencies to serve the national and international interests broadly aimed at effective and efficient use of the electromagnetic spectrum. Time and time again over the years, the League has encouraged and involved itself centrally in efforts leading to advances in the art and the science of radio. The League gives us a way to channel the efforts of individuals into important group contributions with scientific and other results that benefit the nation and society as a whole. What would Hiram Percy Maxim, the original 1AW, what would he make of today's American Radio Relay League? At first, you might guess that he would scarcely recognize what the League has become. We do still have traffic nets, and they can be extremely important during emergencies, but the relay function of the American Radio Relay League is hardly its major focus anymore. On the other hand, this trend toward other purposes was already underway by 1936, the time of Maxim's death. Maxim was a far-sighted man, and it's clear that he would have expected the League to keep up with the times, whatever that meant, and to evolve into something very different from his original vision. Our hobby and the technologies that it depends upon have come a long way since 1914, from spark transmitters and cat's whisker crystal detectors used mostly at wavelengths of hundreds of meters, to solid-state transmitters and software-defined receivers and all the other fancy gadgets we use today at frequencies all the way from tens of kilohertz up to more than 100 gigahertz. Now, I first learned about the League when I was 11 or 12. Like more than a few others that I'm sure are in this room today, by that age I had built crystal sets and one-tube regenerative receivers, and then a Heathkit AR1. My brother and I passed our novice exams together in 1954. We scrounged old copies of the ARRL handbook, and we spent many hours reading them. Each month, we looked forward to the new issue of QST, and we read it from cover to cover. Laird Campbell, W1CUT, Brian Goodman, W1DX, George Grammer, W1DF, Lou McCoy, W1ICP, Rod Newkirk, W9BRD, and especially for us, Ed Tilton, W1HDQ. These guys were among our favorite authors. We built a Heathkit AT1 and we got on the air. We learned about resonant circuits by trial and error. We discovered that it's much easier to couple RF energy into an antenna if you first make it resonant. We improved our code proficiency. We upgraded the general class and then to amateur extra while in high school. With this kind of hands-on experience, acquired at ages between 12 and about 17 or 18, it's hardly surprising that the two of us went on to study physics in college, then to earn PhDs in physics and to become physics professors as adults. We never let our HEM licenses lapse. Incidentally, what with the recent football World Cup in Brazil, I can't help mentioning that Brother Hal, Kilo 2 Papa Tango, was also an All-American soccer player. Alas, he died of bone cancer in 2001. I miss Hal a lot, not least when I'm thinking about some new thing to try in the ham radio domain. As it happens, just before Hal died, I was once again starting to find significant time myself to play radios. I'd like to take you now on a brief tour through the planning and thought processes that led me to create several newly, increasingly popular digital modes for weak signal ham radio communication, using meteor scatter, Earth-Moon-Earth or moon bounce, and just QRP-DXing on the HF bands. I did this myself as a learning exercise. I wanted to learn the basics of digital communication theory, which I knew about vaguely but didn't know any of in detail at that time. And I wanted to introduce some new techniques that I had developed in my own research work in astrophysics into ham radio. The resulting digital protocols are the modes that have become known as FSK 441, JT65, JT9, Whisper, and a few others that I'll probably mention in what follows. So let me turn now to the slides on the screen. Here we are. So my original dream when I turned some attention to this back in 2001 was to organize ways in which modern digitized communication techniques could be moved into ham radio in a way that would optimize the chances for making weak signal QSOs. I had in mind meteor scatter, which I'd played with as a high school student on 6 meters. I had in mind moon bounce, which I always wanted to do but hadn't done myself yet. And I wanted these to be possible at signal levels that were less than those that are generated by megastations. In other words, I was hoping to be able to come up with techniques that would be workable for people with antennas that were suitable for in-town use instead of out in the country, and with significantly less than the legal maximum of power. Now, when you're thinking about designing a digital communication system, you've got a lot of things that you can play with. You've got constraints and trade-offs. As amateurs, we're constrained in the power we can use, and anyway, power is expensive. You're constrained as to what bandwidths you can generate. We typically have ample bandwidth on our VHF and UHF bands, but narrow is still good. In other words, really broadband, spread spectrum types of communication is not going to make you popular with your neighbors, particularly if you're trying to generate enough signal power to generate a reflected signal off the moon and have it still detectable. Your neighbors are not going to like that signal if you make it broadband. I wanted the techniques to be workable with real typical amateur equipment and to not require laboratory-style communication apparatus. I wanted the ordinary contacts to be able to be concluded in a reasonable time, like 5 or 10 minutes. I wasn't interested in the techniques that use very long integration times and, for example, get a signal across the pond on 137 kilohertz, but to make a contact you would need to take 2 weeks or something to complete the QSO. That was not the kind of goal I was looking for. So there are a number of different things you can play with, and in particular I want to draw attention to the coding that would be used on the signal and the modulation techniques that would be used to apply this signal to your radio's output. And it turned out that in order to do the kinds of things I was interested in, meteor scatter, moon bounce, it would certainly require different techniques for different purposes, as you'll see. So the kinds of things you can play with as the design engineer, if you like, you can play with the data rate, the rate at which symbols are generated. You can require particular structure to the message. It's always easier, as you know, from copying very weak CW signals. It's always easier to copy if you know more or less what to expect. You know that you're going to be copying call signs and then perhaps some other stuff. That's a big help. Let's keep the screen on if you can on the, yeah, thank you. Let's keep a terror. I won't know where I am and where we're getting to. Maybe I have some notes here that'll help me if necessary. You can play with the source encoding. That's the way in which you compress the message that you want to exchange into digital bits, zeros and ones, that are actually going to be inside the software, how the message is actually encoded. So that's message compression. You're also going to be able to play with the error control coding. You would like the message to arrive at the other end of the communication channel in a way that you can tell whether it was corrupted or not. And if it was corrupted, perhaps to correct those corruptions and regenerate the original message properly. You can play with the modulation style and the bandwidth, and you are going to need some way of synchronizing the receiver and the transmitter in both time and frequency in order to get the very, very highest possible sensitivity. So there are lots of things that you can play with. Now, the QSOs that I was interested in making possible are going to be very different from rag chews. I'm talking about making a system that will work to exchange call signs and signal reports and perhaps a very small amount of chit-chat, 73, nice to see you again, see you later, see you in the contest next weekend, whatever, but not a lot of additional information. So we can use a lot of ways of structuring the messages so that the system will be more efficient. For meteor scatter, I wanted it to be possible that the interesting information, perhaps a pair of call signs in a signal report or a Roger, should be able to be transmitted in a fraction of a second, because the most typical reflections off of ionized meteor trails last for only a few hundred milliseconds. On the other hand, for moon bounce communication, the signal is more or less constant in amplitude, and we don't have to worry about picking off the very, very brief peaks of signal. But on the other hand, we want to make the information possible so that you can complete a contact within 5 minutes or so. And that meant that we could use timed transmissions, perhaps that would last a minute, and we would then, within that minute, we'd like to get the information rate such that we can exchange a pair of call signs and a few additional bits of information. So those were kind of the ground rules and the basics of what's going to be needed. So we came up with this computer program that came to be called WSJT. It stood for Weak Signal Communication, and then the two last letters of my call sign. So it's a computer program, and it brings these new ideas of coding and modulation into play for ham radio use. It requires a standard single sideband transceiver, and you basically connect the computer sound card output into your microphone input, and the receiver's audio out goes into the computer's audio in, and the software basically takes care of the modulation and demodulation requirements. The current situation is that there are many thousands of users worldwide that are using this stuff. So the next slide shows basically the operating modes. WSJT has a bunch of different ones. FSK 441 is used for meteor scatter. There are a couple of additional modes that are very effective on the 6 meter band for the kind of in-between case where the band is not really open, but there's sort of a background level of ionization that means you can get a weak but more or less constant background signal there all the time at distances, say, from 500 miles up to 800 or 900 or 1,000 miles. That kind of scatter can be used very effectively, and there are a couple of modes which optimize the communication capabilities for that. The mode that was designed for moon bounce, JT65, continues to be extremely popular for that mode of communication, especially on 2 meters, but also on 70 centimeters and 23 centimeters, and even the higher microwave bands. And it also, rather by accident as far as I was concerned, has become extremely popular for QRP DXing at HF. And so many people in this room, I'm sure, have played with JT65 at HF, and that's sort of been a bonus side advantage. And I spend a lot of time on HF myself these days, just playing with it and making sure that the program is as convenient and fun to use as possible. There's another mode called JT4, which has been used for microwave moon bounce. There's the most recent mode is called JT9. It has many of the same characteristics as far as using it is concerned as JT65, but it uses only 1/10 of the bandwidth. It's extremely narrow band, uses only about 15 hertz of bandpass. So you can get a lot of signals into a 1 kilohertz slice of the spectrum, and it's becoming increasingly popular. And then there's this mode called Whisper, which is a good acronym because it's used for very low power transmissions, basically probing propagation conditions. And Whisper has become extremely popular with people that are interested in the science of radio propagation, but also just as a learning tool for shortwave and amateur means of various different kinds. The Whisper stands for the Weak Signal Propagation Reporter. It's a sort of quasi-beacon mode. We don't call it a beacon, but it's sort of like beacons in that it transmits but doesn't conduct two-way conversations. It makes a transmission that lasts for 2 minutes, starting at the top of a UTC minute. You've got to have your computer clock synchronized to UTC. And it randomizes the periods at which it transmits or receives in such a way that if a bunch of people are using it on the same small slice of band, on the same band, you get a chance to hear each other. That is, you don't always transmit at the same time the other guy transmits. Typically, people will set their Whisper system up so that it transmits about maybe 20% of the time and receives 80% of the time. So you basically can hear all the other signals that are on the air while you're not transmitting yourself. The messages are always very simple and straightforward. It includes your call sign, your grid locator, a 4-digit locator that specifies your position on the Earth, and then a 2-digit number which gives the power level at which you're transmitting in dB above 1 milliwatt. So the example call sign that was on the screen a minute ago, and I hope you'll see again in a minute, is K1JT, FN20, my locator, and 37 dB above 1 milliwatt is 5 watts. So that's my typical power when I'm playing Whisper. Whisper is a very efficient mode as far as spectrum usage is concerned, and the tiny little slice of spectrum on each band that is devoted to whispering is only 200 hertz wide. But in that 200 hertz, you can get a dozen or more signals and decode them all, except maybe if a couple of them land on top of each other, but that won't happen the next time they transmit probably. And the signals are only about 6 hertz wide each one. So they're very small in frequency space, and you can get a lot of them into a small space. If your computer that is running Whisper is connected to the internet, you can tick a box on the screen so that all of your reception reports will be uploaded to a central database that's run by W1BW up here in New England somewhere, and the whispernet.org site will display them on a world map, and I'll show you some examples of that in a minute. There are 500 or so people on the air every day whispering to each other, and that's kind of a fun statistic. Over the years since whispering started in 2008, there's something like 200 million of these reception reports now stored in a database at the whispernet.org site. That's what the screen looks like. The vertical display there on the spectrogram is frequency, and that's the full 200 hertz band. I think at the time this screenshot was made, that's on the 30-meter band. So it's a tiny little slice of spectrum on 30 meters. And the little horizontal green dashes are the 2-minute long whisper receptions from various different stations. The full time on the horizontal axis is about half an hour. Each of those vertical stripes is the 1 2-minute interval. And the vertical green lines that you see correspond to the intervals, the 2-minute intervals in which your own station transmitted. So you can sort of keep track of how often you're transmitting there. Here's what the map looks like. Many of you have probably seen this. So you just have lines connecting stations that have been received by each other during and you can specify to the mapping interface here. You can specify exactly what you want to see. You can select a band. Here's a single band display, for example. You can see where that band was open at that time, between what parts of the world. You can specify a particular call sign, for example, your own, and see all the stations that are hearing your signals or that you are hearing their signals. If you click on the little flag that has your call sign on it, it'll pop up a list of all the stations that are hearing you and a list of all the stations that you have reported hearing. That's kind of fun. You can keep track of things. Interestingly, if you try Googling just the word stellar whisper, and you'll come up with a nice website of a guy that is building whisper receiver kits. And you can order the kit for, I think it's $49.95 or something like that. You can build it for either 20 meters or 30 meters. You can put it together in an afternoon, in an hour or two. It's very simple. You can, in fact, order from the same website free lesson plans to be used by teachers in grade schools or middle schools, and the kids can build the receivers. And it's a very good way of getting kids. You don't need a license to receive whisper signals, after all. It's receive only, as well. I mean, you could transmit if you were licensed, but with this hardware, it's receive only. And it's a very effective way of getting some kids interested in building their own electronics and seeing how it all works, and getting themselves interested in things that may very well lead to ham radio and to other things later in life. Let me go on now, because time is moving along, and say a few things about actually using the two-way communication tools as opposed to whisper. JT65, the JT9, and JT4 all use the same basic user message structure. They all use 60-second transmit-receive sequences. So you transmit for the best part of a minute. It's actually about 48 seconds, and then receive during the remaining time. The messages are compact and they're structured so that you typically have 2 call signs and a grid locator, or perhaps CQ and a call sign and a grid locator. They are all modes that have very strong error correction codes built into them, so that at the receiving end, you basically receive the message exactly as it was transmitted, or if the receiving software couldn't figure it out, you get nothing at all. You don't get garbled messages. The modulation in all three of these modes is multi-tone frequency shift keying, and in fact the number after the JT in the mode name gives you the number of different frequencies that are used. So JT9 uses 9 tones, 8 data tones plus 1 tone for synchronization. JT65 similarly is 64 data tones and 1 tone for synchronization. JT4 actually uses only 4 tones, and the sync is built into the 4 tones that actually convey data. And that was an experiment on my part. It works well. It leads to some different characteristics in the software, but that again was part of the learning process as far as I was concerned, teaching myself some of these things. And it turns out they all have their own strengths and are very useful in their own ways. For each one of these modes, you can copy the message that was transmitted at signal levels that are 10 to 15 dB weaker than the weakest thing you could decode by ear with CW. So these are really sensitive modes. They get down well below the noise level of things that you could decode orally. The current usage levels are such that it's actually hard for me to estimate with any accuracy, but I know there are 1,000 or more people using JT65 on 2 meters for moon bounce. I know there must be at least that number because I've worked almost that number of different ones, and many other people have as well. And there are many times that number of users, particularly of JT65, but now increasingly also for JT9 on the HF bands. A basic QSO using any of these modes looks like the messages there in black and red on the right. Somebody calls CQ. In this case, it was RU1AA, calling CQ on 2 meters off the moon. I called him, so I sent RU1AA. This is K1JT. I'm in FN20. That's what the second message means there, the one in red. He comes back and gives me a signal report. He says I'm minus 14. What does that mean, minus 14? It means that my signal is 14 dB below the noise level in a typical SSB receiver's passband, 2.5 kilohertz. That means that probably, since there's some QSB on the signal, it probably means that he could hear my tones, but only barely. It would have been maybe possible to work him on CW with that signal strength, but that's about the limit. You can get down a very good CW operator who's particularly practiced with moon bounce signals, can get down to about minus 15 dB signal to noise on that scale. You might wonder, how can you copy something below the noise level? Because your ear is a good filter, and your ear can filter out things down to about 100 hertz or so, well narrower than the 2500 hertz standard bandwidth that's used for these signal to noise numbers. However, JT65 works down to more like 25, minus 25, or even minus 30, and that's the additional advantage that you get from the digital encoding. Anyway, so I come back to him and say, Roger, and you're minus 7. He's got a big antenna and he's running a lot more power than I am, so he's 7 dB stronger. He sends me Roger, and I say, thanks, Alex, nice to work you again, and so forth. So that's basically the QSO. Each one of those transmissions takes 1 minute, actually 48 seconds. During the last 12 seconds of the minute when you're receiving, the other guy has already stood by. You have to wait 2.5 seconds for the signal to get to the moon and back. So at about 52 seconds on your clock, on your computer, it starts to decode the other guy. It figures, whatever I got, and let's see what it was. And then you have the last 10 seconds, roughly 8 seconds, to figure out what you're going to send back to him. Okay, so that's the way it works. The recent popularity of these modes on the HF bands have been a good excuse for me to put a lot of effort into a new version of the program. It was originally called, and still is called, WSJTX. The X stood for experimental or extended or something, I'm not quite sure what. But anyway, its main target this time was not moon bounce, but QRP work on the HF bands. So it was made to be especially user-friendly. It doesn't have the meteor scatter stuff in it. It only has this one originally had one mode, JT65, and it now has two modes, JT65 and JT9. JT9, I might just mention, is especially optimized for use at the HF bands and even lower, the MF bands. It's a great mode on 160 meters. It will be good for the 470 kilohertz band if and when the FCC gets around to assigning it to us. It's now possible for them to do so, and we hope they will. Perhaps even another band down at 137 kilohertz. In the meantime, some of the experimental stations that are licensed with special FCC privileges down there have been using these modes and find them very effective. JT9 is about 2 dB more sensitive than JT65, and it uses only 1/10 the bandwidth, and those are both important for these uses at the very low end of our radio spectrum where we don't have nearly as many kilohertz to play with. This version of the program, WSJTX, is different from the original WSJT and is similar to another program called JT65-HF, which was written by another person, my friend W6CQX, Joe Large, and he wrote it especially for use at HF frequencies. So it uses the same protocol, the same decoder actually, but with a different user interface. So WSJTX was made to use a bunch of those same ways of making the program easier to use, particularly at HF. It decodes, instead of one signal that you know you're trying to work, perhaps in moon bounce, it decodes all the signals in the passband. So you use a typical SSB receiver's passband, 2 or 3 kilohertz, maybe even as much as 5 kilohertz if you've got a filter that wide. That's even better. And it basically just goes down the line and decodes all the signals in the passband, somewhat like CW skimmer, if you like. It'll decode first the one that you're tuned right to, because you're probably working that guy. You want to see what he said right away. Then it decodes all the rest. Those are very effective. Let's say, it's made to be very user-friendly in ways that also make it interface to JT Alert, a program that is careful to keep track of your log and tell you that's a new country you needed, you didn't work that yet, or you didn't work that state on this band. JT Alert will flag that and pop up a screen display or make a noise on the speaker. PSK Reporter is a great tool that some of you, I'm sure, know about it. I'll show you a map in a minute of that. Ham spots, there are various ways in which these automatically decoded modes will send the call signs that were decoded up to a central database, and they get displayed on a world map. It works with Ham Radio Deluxe, it works with DX Labs Commander, it works with OmniRig, all those kinds of things. Here it is in the way it looks like on your screen when you're operating, and we've sort of had suggested sub-bands to use on each one of the HF bands, where the JT65 piece of spectrum, which is typically 2 kilohertz wide, is now sort of a baseline place to start, and then up to 2 kilohertz above that are JT9 signals. So typically in one frequency display, like the one you see here, which goes from it goes from 0 up to 4 kilohertz. Those are the audio frequencies coming out of your SSB receiver. So those are numbers which would be added to the dial frequency of your transceiver when it's in upper sideband mode. So signals are spread out there over that 4 kilohertz chunk of spectrum. And you can see that there's a JT65 portion and a JT9 portion. You'll also see there that the JT65 signals are each, 177 hertz wide. So you can only get, 6 or 8 of them into the full width of the spectrum that's used there, whereas the JT9 signals are very narrow by comparison. They're less than 1/10 of the width, and so you can get 20 or 30 or 40 of those in the 1 kilohertz passband that is a little bit higher up in frequency. The decoded signals show up down below. On the left-hand side of the screen is the open display of all the signals in the passband, and on the right-hand side are the messages that are being sent and received from your station to the other guy that you're trying to work. Here's another version of that that's a little bit easier to see and has the extra color in it, showing that the reds, the lines that are highlighted in red are ones that have your own call sign in them, so presumably those are the other guy speaking to you. And the ones that are highlighted in yellow on the right-hand side are your own transmitted messages that you've sent. So you can keep track of where you are in the QSO and whether you have to send him a signal report yet, or did I already send that, or should I send him Roger, or just what. So you can keep track of what's going on. There's the PSK Reporter World Map screen. Another interesting way of seeing where the bands are open. You can tell the reporter to display only the signals on 20 meters or only the ones on 10 meters, whatever you like. Or you can do as I did here in this display, which is, say, display all the bands. It uses a different color for each band. So you can see that at this time the band was open from most of the US to Japan on 20 meters. It was open from most Europe to South America on 10 meters. A lot of stuff getting across the pond from Europe to North America on 10 meters, as well as 15 meters and even 20 meters. Daytime was, the band was open. And then you can see all the nighttime things that were open between the Far East and Moscow or Eastern Europe or whatever. You can keep track of what the ionosphere is doing in all those interesting ways. I think I've already mentioned the basic advantages of JT9 over JT65. The main one is that it's much narrower in bandwidth, so it's very spectral efficient. It includes the ability to send signal reports that are greater than 0 on this scale of signal-to-noise ratio. JT65 couldn't do that because it was built for EME, and you can't make that much power reflect off the moon to give you a signal that strong. But anyway, JT9 corrected that flaw as far as HF use is concerned. It also, I took some care to make the JT9 signal extremely clean transmitted. JT65 signals are clean if your whole system, including your computer sound card and your transceiver and so forth, is guaranteed to be linear. But of course it isn't. If you turn up the gain too high, you can flat top, and that will put audio harmonics. And if those audio harmonics get out through the filter in your transceive chain, your JT65 signal will have harmonics up the band. And we see far too many of those on the air doing that. Turn the audio gain down to follow the instructions in the manual. But JT9 signals basically don't do that because they are constrained in ways that prevents that kind of flat topping from occurring. And I can go into that in more detail, but I won't at this point. Just for fun, here's a summary table of the weak signal modes that are kind of fun to pay a little attention to. So for single sideband, again, using this reference bandwidth of 2.5 kilohertz, you need a positive signal-to-noise ratio in order to carry out a single sideband QSO. In fact, at something like plus 3 dB, you can barely hear the other guy, and maybe if you know who it is, you can recognize what his call sign is, but it's going to be tough. With FSK 441, you can get down just a little bit below that noise level, maybe -1 or so. With CW, which is very narrow in its own spectral width, if you've got a good trained ear, you can get down to -10 or maybe even -15 if you really are good at it. With iSCAT, you can do a little better than that. That takes advantage of this very weak background scatter level signal on 6 meters. And then with the JT4 and JT65, JT9, and whisper modes, you can get down a lot farther below that. Whisper is the most sensitive of all, partly because it uses 2-minute transmissions instead of 1 minute. And its modulation mode is very effective as well. Well, I'm just going to say a couple more things. If you are kind of intrigued by all of this and are a bit of a computer nut as well as a radio nut, you might be interested that the software is all open sourced. It's all available on the web. You can download the source code as well as the installation package. And if you're interested in the programming details, a few of them are shown there. And contributors are welcome. We've now got a dozen or more people that are working on software, primarily on WSJTX, but to some extent on the other programs as well. Now, I'm going to return for a moment now by way of starting to sum up and say a few things about the thread that I started at the beginning, and to also take a little bit of this, what I promised to do, and gaze into the future. So how do we know what's going to be happening during ARRL's second century? Well, of course we don't. And I thought it was worthwhile looking at a few scientific predictions that have been made over the years, and you can see a couple there. Simon Newcomb was a very distinguished American astronomer at Yale, and basically he couldn't see how, they understood how telescopes work. How are we ever going to know much more than we know now? That was in 1888. Kelvin in 1900 said all that remains is a few more decimal places in the measurements. And obviously that kind of stuff, I'm not going to make the mistake of trying to make that kind of a prediction. Those are hard to make. Einstein had an interesting thing to say about the nature of scientific discovery. He said no matter how we may single out a complex phenomenon from nature, its theoretical treatment will never prove to be ultimately conclusive. I believe that this process of deepening of theory has no limits. Now, that isn't necessarily what all scientists would say. In fact, another very famous Nobel laureate physicist, Richard Feynman, thought quite differently from Einstein's description that's shown here. Feynman basically said discovering the laws of the universe, the laws of nature, if you like, is sort of like discovering America. When it's done, and you'll know it. And we don't know when we're going to get there, but I think in principle that it can be done. So, scientists won't necessarily all agree. But I think we all will agree that there are many ways in which extrapolating beyond sort of what you can see a little bit more progress in the ways in which we've been making progress recently, that's easy to predict. We're going to do a lot more, say, with software-defined processing of radio signals, but beyond that, it's going to be tough to say things in any detail. Lewis Thomas, a very good scientist in his own right, said that in real life, every field of science is incomplete. And most of them, whatever their records of accomplishment may have been during the last 200 years, are still in their various earliest stages. And that may very well be true of the things we're talking about here as well, too. It's just not possible for us to extrapolate in any confident way about what's going to be happening very many years from now. There are a few things that I'm sure we can count on. Radios are going to become increasingly digital. The conversion from analog to digital and from digital back to analog on the transmitting side is going to be occurring closer and closer to the antennas. In fact, pretty much at the antenna can be done already. And that gives us a lot of tools that basically get around problems with analog electronics. Good engineering in this field is then very definitely going to be a combination of both hardware and software in coming years. It already is. I think a couple of other things we can be very sure about. Science and technology and amateur radio are going to continue to benefit from a very healthy cross-fertilization between amateurs and professionals. I know that has been true in my own case and in a lot of other cases of people that I know well. And I'm very sure that amateur radio is going to continue to thrive and to serve the public interest. So by way of summing up now, let me just turn back to the theme underlying the personal statement that I made at the very beginning. My own boyhood fascination with the art and science of radio got me into this hobby. And from there, it launched me on a path leading to advanced degrees in physics, to teaching university physics, and to making fundamental research contributions to mankind's knowledge of the laws of nature. In a similar way, I know that very many others in this room indeed, and a far larger number of hams who are not with us today, can tell their own stories about how amateur radio has been important to their own technical or professional development and to the contributions that they have been able to make to society. In many ways that we don't often think about, the activities of the ARRL over its 100-year existence have helped to make these things possible. It started in 1914 when, around the country, groups of like-minded people fascinated by the newly emerging art of radio got together and formed local wireless clubs. And thanks to the foresight of some key people working right here in Hartford, those local clubs led to a National Radio Association, the ARRL. In 1919, just after World War I, the League worked hard to see that the airwaves would be reopened for use by amateurs. At that time, rapidly increasing use of the limited spectrum required government intervention as well in order to maintain order. Long wavelengths were thought to be the most efficient and the most desirable, so it's hardly surprising that powerful military and commercial shipping interests got the first claims on them. Commercial radio broadcasting had become feasible at about this time as well, and the potential market for it was huge. But as a countermeasure, in the 1920s, the ARRL made a strong and very effective case that it was also very much in the public interest to have a viable amateur radio service. Perhaps the regulators thought they were getting off easy by allocating to amateurs those supposedly useless short wavelengths of 200 meters and down. But whatever their motivations, everybody here knows that it worked out well. The US Navy and the commercial shipping interests got the long wavelengths that they wanted. The commercial broadcasters got pretty much what is now the AM broadcast band. And we amateurs got the short waves, frequencies of 1.5 megahertz and higher. And within a few years, we astonished all the experts by showing that these short waves could support worldwide communication with relatively simple amateur-built equipment. The experts truly were astonished. It's a great story, and it could not have happened in the same way without the ARRL. So let's continue to make whatever contributions we can to the art and science of radio and to the public good in other ways. Let us also work to keep our league a strong and effective voice on our behalf. I'd like to think that someone will be here 100 years from now looking back fondly on all the good things accomplished by amateur radio during ARRL's second century. Thanks very much for your attention.